the fairy tale of Santa Claus starts to give us these pictures and these concepts
Mm.
that start to lay a foundation, or as I think I said earlier, it kind of tills the soil of the heart and mind.
Mm.
It's kind of preparing us for the real thing.
Mm.
And so here you have Santa Claus. And again, with young children, the imagination can be such a good tool because they have a hard time. Their minds aren't developed where they can think as abstractly as, teenagers and adults. So if you're going to try to talk to your kid about God's omniscience or his omnipresence, that's just a little more of an abstract concept versus Santa Claus, who knows if you've been naughty or nice. That kind of takes omniscience, a part of omniscience. And of course, we would not say it captures the whole truth, but it's the seeds of the whole truth.
It's difficult to not feel overwhelmed and discouraged at times as you look out into the culture and see all the things that are coming at our kids, at our families, at our schools, at our churches. The challenges that we face in raising the next generation, sometimes it can feel a bit overwhelming on how to navigate all of it.
Yeah, and that's why MAVEN exists. Our mission is to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, create beauty for the cause of Christ. This is our way of saying we want to help them know what they believe, why they believe it, why it matters, to develop a Christian worldview that is robust, that will help them to navigate all aspects of this life. And so that is why we have our virtual training. We have our online courses, we have our podcasts, we do stuff through social media. We also have our live events. We do MAVEN conferences every year. We do speaking to equip churches and parents, schools, pastors, students themselves. And then we also have our immersive experiences, our worldview and apologetic mission trips for students. And so all year long, MAVEN is committed to equipping the next generation and the people who are discipling the next generation.
So as this year is coming to an end, this is an important time for MAVEN. It's a vital time for us to raise the resources and the funds that we need to continue our work into the next year, 2025, with all that we have in store through our virtual events, our virtual training, our live events, our immersive experiences, all that we're doing here at MAVEN.
Yeah, 20 to 30% of our annual budget comes in this last month of the year. And so we want to encourage you, if you have been benefiting from the work of MAVEN, if your young people, your family, your churches have benefited, if you've been to a MAVEN conference, if you're just a regular listener to the podcast, we want to encourage you to reinvest back into MAVEN. And so at the end of the year, we want to ask you to consider a generous financial gift to the work of MAVEN. You can go to our homepage, maventruth.com, and in the right-hand corner, there's a donate button. Click on the donate button and give your best gift today. Erin, you know what time of the year it is?
The most wonderful time of the year.
You were hesitant to say anything.
Because I figured you're trying to trick me.
I would never do such a thing. I would only deceive you.
It's the most wonderful time of the year.
Yeah, it is the most wonderful time of the year. And that time of the year is football season. Erin, football season. In fact,
football season has been going since August.
That's right. And it's still continuing.
Oh my goodness.
And I mean, I wore my Steel City hat the last podcast, hoping you would make mention of it so that I would be able to publicly declare my love for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Huge Steeler fan. Family grew up in Pittsburgh, the Steel City. And I just want to say, If you're not a follower of football, shame on you. But just want to remind everyone out there that the Steelers are, at the time of this recording, are sitting in first place in the AFC North.
Oh, you are jinxing them big time.
No, I'm not. I'm very confident that they will continue. They will win the AFC North title. If there are any Baltimore Raven fans right now who are listening, go ahead and
them.
turn off this podcast. You're not allowed to listen to this podcast anymore.
We have lots of friends that are Ravens fans.
Those aren't friends. They're not friends.
Okay, in the last episode, we talked about disordered affections. And so if you think
that pointed at me?
The most wonderful time of the year is because of football, you might have some disordering in your affections.
You know very well I have disordered affections. And, I've been going to therapy for it. So, okay, we wanted to use our whole discussion on Santa Claus. We've done 2 podcasts now on Santa Claus. We wanted to do a third one on him to talk about a larger issue, because I think Santa is related to this issue. And I think what Santa can help us to do, right, is it can help us to see that the imagination is a good thing, and that the imagination is a tool from God to help us see the reality of the world. Okay. Now we're going to have to unpack this because there's a lot to say here. People are thinking, well, what? And that might just be, if you feel a little skeptical about that what I've just said, number one, you're wrong. Number two, it might be because we have been shaped by a very modern, secular culture.
I was going to say, if you hear the good about the imagination and you're skeptical of that, then you have modern ears. That's why.
Yeah, exactly. And this is even where in the modern world, you see how different cultures are dominated by different worldview ideas. And so in the US, we're kind of dominated by the secularism, this naturalism, the scientific naturalism that really suppresses the mystery of the world, the invisible world, the supernatural, and it can suppress it in a way that it impacts what we take to be plausible in this culture. And so the idea of demons and angels and spiritual warfare and stuff like that, that's just, we don't, even Christians don't talk much about that because the cultural ideas can suppress the truth, the reality of the spiritual realm. But you go over to India, in a culture that's dominated by Hinduism and a Hindu worldview, or even there's parts of the U.S. where there's a large population of Hindus who have gathered in a metro area or something. There you will hear much more about demonic activity, spiritual activity. I was talking to a pastor down in Texas who works with Hindus from India, and he talks about just all of the spiritual encounters he's had in working with these folks and the demonic activity he's seen. So all of that to say is that the cultural ideas and the worldviews that come to dominate the culture can make things plausible, more plausible, or less plausible, and they can suppress the truth of reality. And so that's where I think your comment about, hey, if you have a problem with imagination, it's because of our modern culture.
Modern and secular, like you said, because the imagination, which of course starts right when we're made, young kids have such a vibrant imagination. And that should be cultivated because we want to teach our children that reality isn't just what we see and it's not just what we can touch, but actually there's a reality that we don't see. And our imaginations help us to embrace that.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially with young kids, it actually can till the soil of their soul and prepare the soil of their soul to be more open to the supernatural. So online, there's a really good article that talks about this in relation to Santa. It's entitled, "Okay, Virginia, there's no Santa Claus, but there is God." And we will link to that in our description and in our show notes. The author is Tony Woodlief. He's a Catholic writer and columnist. And I want to just pull some I think some good quotes out of here. I'm going to read them, Erin, and then you're going to react. Okay. We want to hear your opinion.
Oh
on
my
this.
goodness.
We want to hear your wisdom.
So we're going to read his article and think more deeply about the imagination and myth and fairy tales.
No, that's not sexy enough to pull in the audience. Okay. Well, no, I'm going to read it. You're going to react.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
And you're going to rage, or you're going to, you're going to be filled with outrage. We got to make this bleed.
Okay.
All right. So here we go. Here's quote number 1. He says towards the beginning of the article, he says, "I suspect that fairy tales and Santa Claus do prepare us to embrace the ultimate fairy tale, the one C.S. Lewis believed was ingrained in our being." New research from the Université de Montréal and the University of Ottawa indicates that children aren't overly troubled upon learning that Santa is a myth. But the researchers remain puzzled because while children eventually abandon Santa, they keep believing in God. Lewis would say this is because God is real.
Well, bringing up C.S. Lewis, of course, reminds me of how C.S. Lewis became a Christian, and part of him becoming a Christian was because his mind was baptized by fairy tales. It's a phrase he would use, and he talks about his conversion from atheism to Christianity. It was a journey, but at one point, he's in his book Surprised by Joy, he describes these conversations that he had with several classmates, including J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, who was a Catholic. And Tolkien, as they're arguing basically about the possibility of God, Tolkien says to Lewis, both who were very well-read. Not well-read doesn't even describe those men, but in fairy tale and myth. And Tolkien says to Lewis, "Don't you understand? This is the myth that is real, the myth of all myths." And that was the stone in Lewis's shoe. As you know, Greg Koukl talks about putting a stone in people's shoes. That was a stone that Lewis could not shake. And so this is appealing to that kind of what I mentioned earlier, that fairy tales help us in realizing there is this world that we cannot see.
Yeah. And Santa Claus is one of the fairy tales of the world. And how can it prepare us to embrace the ultimate fairy tale? Well, I mean, when you think about Santa and the fairy tale of Santa, you have this individual who knows if you've been naughty or nice, right? Has a certain amount of knowledge. Right now, of course, and again, this is where, because we as evangelicals don't have a theology of imagination, okay? And we haven't been taught how to incorporate, fairy tale and myth into our education. And modern education has done us a great disservice this way. Again, like you've already mentioned, read Lewis, read Tolkien on this, but Santa, the fairy tale of Santa Claus starts to give us these pictures and these concepts that start to lay a foundation, or as I think I said earlier, it kind of tills the soil of the heart and mind. It's kind of preparing us for the real thing.
Mm.
And so here you have Santa Claus. And again, with young children, the imagination can be such a good tool because they have a hard time. Their minds aren't developed where they can think as abstractly as, teenagers and adults. So if you're going to try to talk to your kid about God's omniscience or his omnipresence, that's just a little more of an abstract concept versus Santa Claus, who knows if you've been naughty or nice. That kind of takes omniscience, a part of omniscience. And of course, we would not say it captures the whole truth, but it's the seeds of the whole truth. And so thinking in terms of something like Santa Claus and myth and fairy tales and all of this as a development of the imagination that will prepare the heart and mind ultimately for the real thing. So you see, so you've got other parallels with like Santa and God, right? The generous nature of Santa, the Santa giving without receiving, right? I mean, no one. Someone might say, "Well, what about the cookies?" Oh, okay, give me a break. That's not really reciprocal.
Well,
that was a delayed laugh, Erin. It was a really delayed laugh. I just want to highlight that. I was expecting an earlier laugh, and that kind of threw me off because I thought it was pretty funny.
Well, I'm thinking about what you're saying about the modern church. And I think too, don't you think part of why we've maybe pushed away or gotten so defensive about myths and fairy tales? Because that's what I think I would say. It seems like Christians almost will get defensive about, stories where there's witchcraft,
or especially if there's magic,
things like that. So this push again, but
throw out the Chronicles of Narnia,
right? Because not only is Chronicles of Narnia have a witch in it, it also has Santa Claus because Lewis sticks Santa Claus in there. But don't you think part of that reaction is because we have moved away from the arts as a church too? Because art brings in an aspect of wonder.
Yeah.
You have to sit and contemplate art, whether it's poetry or pictures or whatever it is, and it provokes in you a wondering about what the artist is, because the artist is putting something in front of you to think about, whether it's musical notes or words or whatever, again, pictures. Yeah. And so the church has basically unhitched from the good and beautiful part of God in that way, because art, it is that good and beautiful piece.
Yeah.
And so we've detached from it. So it just becomes this utilitarian, almost just this, like, if it's not useful, then we don't need it.
Yeah, useful in the next 2 seconds.
Right. If it's not, yeah, and even useful, it's like, well, what does that mean? Because we're human beings, so there's all kinds of aspects about us. But I just think this move away has been partly because we've moved away from art as a whole in modern times. Yeah.
So because of that, I think you're onto something there, and because of that, the imagination is not developed.
Yes.
It's not developed, or it's underdeveloped. And this is why, maybe one of the reasons why Christians produce such bad art. And not, of course, not everyone, but if you look at the history of Christianity in Western civilization compared to today, there's no comparison, right? And so, yeah, I think we've failed our people that way. And now, I think that gets us into these other quotes here. Okay, so
real quick, I just want to say, and adults might be cursed because of modernity, or we adults might be messed up because of modernity.
Yeah, speak for yourself, Erin.
But children don't have this problem. This is what children have no problem with imagining things they can't make sense of.
Yeah.
And often it'll be that we squelch that in children instead of cultivating it, which is what we're talking about today, is actually cultivating your child's imagination and hopefully your own along the way.
Yeah.
But children don't have this problem. This is why they love fairy tales from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Because this is part of the imprint of God in each of us, right? We have this natural bent towards wondering and imagining things that aren't right in front of us.
Yeah, and this is where there's kind of current discussion in the church about enchantment and disenchantment, and how our culture disenchants us with its worldview. But we live in an enchanted world that's filled with the supernatural, the magical, if you will. Okay, here's quote number 2 from the article. As a parent, so this is Tony Woodlief writing this, as a parent, I believe, with the older apologist, that it's essential to preserve a small, inviolate space in the heart of a child, a space where he is free to believe impossibilities. The fantasy writer George MacDonald, author of The Light Princess and the Golden Key, who C.S. Lewis esteemed...
And The Princess and the Goblin and...
yes.
And other wonderful fairy tales. If you don't know George MacDonald's writing, you need to. Anyway, sorry, I had to interrupt.
You had to interrupt.
He only listed 2, which are wonderful stories.
But he said the fantasy writer George MacDonald, whom C.S. Lewis esteemed as one of his greatest inspirations, suggested that it is only by gazing through magic-tinted eyes that one can see God. Mm-hmm. With his divine alchemy, MacDonald wrote, he turns not only water into wine, but common things into radiant mysteries. Okay.
Oh, you're stopping there?
Yeah, react.
I love George MacDonald. And it, kind of like Lewis, it's like, how could I say it any better than that? So that is, this is what we're saying about the turning water into wine and common things into radiant mysteries. I mean, this is what we're talking about, because it's like, is Jesus a historical figure who existed? And yes, but is what he did something that goes beyond what we have historical record of? Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
Yeah. And it's interesting he mentions apologists here, because we think of apologists as the rational defenders of the faith. And that is certainly a part of apologetics. There's a rational defense. But Paul Gould has written a really good book, Cultural Apologetics, where I think he gives us a much more holistic picture of the apologetic enterprise. And he talks about the importance of the mind and, really focusing on truth and arguing rationally for truth. But then he talks about the conscience and laying out the case morally that Christianity is good and the good it produces. But then he also talks about the imagination and how that is part of our task in apologetics. Making a defense of the faith includes the true, the good, and the beautiful. Mm-hmm. And the imagination can help open us up to the beautiful, a space where he is free to believe in impossibilities. Mm-hmm. For the heart of it, keeping that inviolate space in the heart of a child. And so this is where I think, again, something like the Santa Claus myth and the pretend, and seeing that through things like Santa Claus. Because if you think about it, there's not really, in our culture, we don't have a lot of that kind of mythology. And Santa Claus is kind of a robust mythology. It's not like the Tooth Fairy. I mean, there's not like a kind of robust view of the Tooth Fairy, what the Tooth Fairy does.
The Easter Bunny.
Or the Easter Bunny, right? But this is a much deeper, richer myth that can carve out some space in our kids, or till the soil, if you will, of their imagination to, I love kind of the way he puts this, right? Gazing through magic-tinted eyes It's only by gazing through magic tinted eyes that one can see God. And so that there's a preparation of heart and mind in that young child to eventually see the God of reality.
Well, to see that the incarnation is possible. Like God entered into humanity. God became man. God took on flesh. A God of spirit took on flesh. And so you think about something like the incarnation. Now, this takes an imagination, not because it's not true, but because we are stuck in a material body.
And you're a material girl. Sorry, I had to throw that in. I couldn't resist. For all of you kids of the 80s, you know that quote right there.
Kunkel. So you see, I mean, even something like the incarnation, which again, we do think of apologetics sometimes as just, well, we can believe that Jesus is who he said he was because of these different evidences, but robust apologetics will, like J.P. Moreland talks about, taking down barriers that people have to eventually lead to belief in God and who he is, right? And so part of those barriers might be, well, I don't believe in anything I can't see or just in the natural world, or this doesn't make sense to me because I have a body and I've never not had a body. So how could I imagine a God who's a spirit?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where the arts and the imagination can be a powerful apologetic. Sometimes seeing a movie or reading a story opens you up more. It's kind of a different entry point, right? And Lewis talks about that. It's a different entry point kind of to the soul. And this can open us up more to the reality of the supernatural. Now, this leads us to quote 3. Tony Woodlief says, "This sheds light on a seeming paradox in St. Paul's letter to Roman Christians." And he's quoting now from Romans chapter 1, verses 19. "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made." And then Woodlief says this. He says, "How does one see, quote unquote, invisible attributes? Only people raised on fairy tales can make sense of that. It belongs in a terrain where magic glasses can illumine what was heretofore hidden, where rabbit holes open into wonderlands."
That the invisible attributes seen by what God's made, and him saying people raised on fairy tales, only people raised on fairy tales can make sense of that. I immediately thought about The Magician's Nephew, which I just recently read with our youngest son. And in The Magician's Nephew, you get to be in Narnia when Aslan creates it. And if you, listener, have not read The Magician's Nephew, well, you should read the whole series. But The Magician's Nephew lets you sit in Narnia and watch Aslan create it. And it reminds you of Genesis 2. And of course, Lewis is pulling from Genesis 2. But this fairy tale that Lewis wrote, I got choked up reading it with Jonah recently because I've read it before, but it helps you to imagine how God could have made the world. And Lewis has Aslan singing this song, and it's the most beautiful scene. And I got choked up because you're reading this fairy tale, and it's helping me to imagine something that actually did happen. Whether it happened exactly that way or not isn't the point. It's that it broadens my mind to be open to, this is how it could have happened. And certainly it did happen. And it drew out for me the beauty of what it would have been like to be there, to see God breathe and sing and speak the world into existence. This is what fairy tales do.
Yeah. And again, just relating this back to Santa, here's this generous figure who gives joyfully and not for something in return. I mean, that is that whole part of the Santa fairy tale um, goes against the modern consumeristic culture, right? And there's a nobility to that. There's a nobility to the Santa myth that kind of prepares our hearts for part of one of the major themes of Christmas, the nativity, the giving of God, his generosity in taking on human flesh in the incarnation of Christ.
Well, okay, not to just stay on Narnia, but that what you're saying then is making me think about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because of course, if you haven't read that book, you need to read that book, because when Santa Claus comes in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, they have been in perpetual winter. But the sign that Santa's like a prophet, because now they know something is changing, and now Christmas has come. And of course, the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve coming are part of this prophecy that Aslan's going to return. But Santa Claus for Lewis is he's like a prophet that Aslan's returning, that he's coming back. Yeah. And so I'm basically making an apologetic that people need to read Narnia, because you will understand the story, the great story, better by reading the fairy tale of Narnia. Yeah. It helps you to understand the true story.
Yeah. Well, and here's a fourth and final quote from this article. Tony Woodlief closes. Oxford University Press recently announced that it will be dropping words like dwarf, elf, and devil from its children's dictionary to make room for words like blog, euro, and biodegradable.
Oh, barf. That is just terrible.
That is Erin's scholarly reaction to this.
You want to exchange dwarf and elf and devil with biodegradable and blog?
Well, and this is what Tony Woodlief writes after this. He says, a blow, not just to language, but to the imagination.
Exactly.
I'm sticking with Santa, however, knowing that my children will gradually exchange the fairy tales of youth for a faith, I hope, in mysteries that even diehard Christians seem increasingly embarrassed to admit as such. In our house, at least, there's no shame in believing the impossible.
Wow. That's beautifully said.
And a powerful argument for Santa.
A really powerful argument for introducing our children to myths and fairy tales and the good that it does for them.
Yeah.
And I would argue again, I think for us too, that like C.S. Lewis, again, he's not a perfect person, but I think we learn from him this way because he never stopped reading fairy tales. And he argued not only are fairy tales good for children, but they're good for adults too. And this is why. Yeah. This is why.
And this is even with not just our young kids, but our older kids and us as adults. And I fail in this, but continuing to read fiction, right? Like, so we have a number of volumes of Charles Dickens' Christmas stories. Of course, the most famous is A Christmas Carol. And obviously you have a piece of fiction. It wouldn't be in the genre of fairy tale, but it's fictional. And so it's make-believe, it's pretend. But that story, if you think about the Christmas Carol, what it does to our imagination, as you think about the character of Scrooge, and then you think about Marley and Scrooge being visited by these ghosts, right? And how all of that quote unquote untrue stuff is a reflection of some of the deep truths of reality, and how that story moves us. And it's through the doorway of imagination.
Yeah.
And
well,
so this
the ghosts help Scrooge to see what he can't see.
Yeah.
Some of it, spiritual things outside of Scrooge, but it's helping Scrooge to see what his hardness of heart can't allow him to see.
Yeah. So this is where, I mean, we would say with our kids and within our family, we're okay with Santa. We're okay with a Christmas Carol. We're okay with these beautiful kind of myths and stories because the imagination is a tool that God can use. I want to close with this quote, and I actually don't even know where I got this quote from.
What?
This is one I filed away for a long time, and I cannot find the source on it.
So are you just going to take credit?
I shouldn't have even just said that. I should have just passed this off as my own.
Here's a quote I wrote.
So if anyone can find the source of this quote, please let us know. But this is the closing quote. And it's the context of this article is like Santa. And this is what the author says. He says, I wonder what C.S. Lewis would say about all this modern controversy regarding old traditions. The idea of treating children as mini adults and banishing fairy tale from childhood as, quote unquote, lying is an interesting concept. For years, children were immersed in childhood fairy tales. Make-believe was part of childhood to be treasured for short years before maturity corrupted its innocence with skepticism. Santa was everywhere in our Christian society 100 years ago, and children and families were more religious, not less so. Culture was more steeped in Christ than we experience in our post-Christian era as well. Childish belief in Santa and fairy tales did not crush future faith. Rather, it seemed to enhance it by tuning young minds to the wonders and possibilities of the metaphysical. Perhaps it is not make-believe that is the issue in our society. Perhaps it is the exaltation of realism that is the issue. Hubris belief that we understand all there is about the world, that only what we see, experience, and touch is real, or what can be proven by scientific method and analysis. Is it really the dabbling in fairy tales and possibilities beyond the ordinary into the metaphysical encouraged during the earliest days of childhood that causes so much faithless misery in our current culture? Again, I wonder what C.S. Lewis would say. MAVEN exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.